Our next person who's going to give a talk is Eric Sapirstein, and Eric is with E&S Resources, and he has been critical to the Bay Planning's efforts in Washington, D.C. in terms of helping guide us from the standpoint of the political issues, the administration issues, and the funding issues. And Eric is going to talk about the impact, the political impact of the Corps. The Corps can't do it. Eric can do it because the Corps is not able to advocate positions due to their working with Congress. So we have somebody on the outside who can give us the down and dirty of what's really happening in Washington. And therefore, the Corps staff are free from any retribution. How's that? Does that work? It works. Okay, Eric.
Thank you, John. And I have a habit of trailing off, so since if I trail off, somebody scream louder, I won't be offended. So, Len, the question that I get asked in D.C. is not where the bathrooms are, it's where the damn money is.
Yeah, there we go.
This was supposed to be a Punch and Judy show. I was supposed to have Roger Cockrell, who many of you may know. He is a former Corps official. He's now Senator Feinstein's top water person in the Appropriations Committee. And unfortunately, he is subject to the beck and call of his masters in the Senate, and he is in Louisiana right now taking a look at what's going on down there on the flood protection issues. So he was unfortunately not able to come out. He wanted to come out, he said, to say hello and to tell you that he has your back. So with that, what I want to do is look at the Corps' planning process, but look at it through the physical impacts that we're all aware of what's going on in Washington right now. And I'm going to go through a couple of sort of general items that you'll know implicitly what's going on in D.C., but they all lead or funnel into the FY13 budget process and what we may or may not see in the next couple of months after the election. So the drivers of the policy issues right now, the elections, of course, you've got the deficit that's overwhelming the spending debate, you've got the fiscal cliff that I'll get into in a little bit, but that's essentially what we're faced with at January 2nd. In spending cuts and expiration of Bush tax cuts. And then we have the new realities of going forward, irrespective of who wins the presidency, who controls the Congress. It doesn't really matter. In the next several charts, you'll see why it doesn't matter. We have a new reality on how federal programs and partnerships with local state agencies and the private sector have to be adjusted. Okay, so the election impact that does drive a lot of the discussion. Number one, I think it's obvious that we're in a close election. Whatever happens in the election, we won't have a mandate. What we'll have is a divided result. We'll have probably a split Congress again. It looks, you know, there's an old saying in Washington, you know, you keep sharp instruments away from 2-year-olds and elected officials because they can hurt themselves. And you've seen it in this election cycle. You've got Senate seats that should be going Republican are now going to stay Democrat, most likely because members, the candidates have said some very foolish things and have said, well, you know, like the Aiken issue in Missouri and Indiana, these are 2 states that were considered Republican pickups. It looks now that they will stay in the Democrat, or will go Democratic. And so it sort of makes you think that we're going to have a Senate that's going to be almost evenly divided as it is now, but in Democratic control. You'll have a House that's Republican, and then you've still got the same dynamic at work as far as the policymaking process goes in the next couple of years. But again, what's critical is that we will have a new dynamic in the form of the deficit, basically running everything from this point forward in the decision-making process. One thing that I think we're going to see coming out of the election is rule changes on the way Congress works. There's an old saying that Ronald Reagan, I think, made use of on the international front, that unilateral disarmament is not necessarily a good thing. And that's what happened when we looked at the Republican Congress denying the use of earmarks, so that you couldn't, in the case of the Corps of Engineers, have Congress put a request in for flood protection, or to say in the Oakland Harbor situation, we're going to raise funding a certain amount for Oakland Harbor dredging. That was done away with. What happened? They can't cut deals because they can't give a member of Congress something that they can say, okay, I'll hold my nose and vote for this other policy issue because I'm getting something over here. They can't even get worded through right now because of the anti-earmark mandates. I know that's probably common knowledge to most of you, but what isn't common knowledge is that the Republican majority, the rank and file in the House particularly, are saying, you know, we've got to figure out a way that we don't abdicate our responsibilities and have some say on how money is spent on key policy issues. So I think next year, January, we're going to see rule changes that will allow traditional public purpose delivery of public goods to allow Congress some way to put in place priorities that they deem sufficient. And later in this conversation, you'll see what I mean by what's in the FY13 budget. And finally, new priorities. I think that what we're going to see as a result of the elections and the shortage of federal assistance is that there's going to be a concerted effort to decide what priorities should be funded and how they're going to be funded. Are they going to be exclusively federal? Are they going to boost the local share requirements for core projects? Or are there going to be public-private partnerships? So what's driving this issue? Everybody knows the deficit is driving the issues of policy making right now in Washington. But what I want you to see, if it projects well enough for the people in the back, the deficit has grown to unsustainable levels. We all know that. But you see how the red lines out to 2085 keep growing. That's even with the expiration of the Bush tax cut rates. Just simply getting rid of the tax cut rates and going back to, say, the Clinton era tax rates, where essentially the highest rate was about 38% maybe, and there was an adjustment to the estate tax and everything else, you still have a deficit that grows as a percentage of gross domestic product. I'm not an economist, but the bottom line is that you can't continue operating the way we're operating right now from a federal funding program basis. Okay, the other issue is what's in play if no action is taken. This is just going to describe what happens to core programs, any program at the federal level. But here's what you see. If you can't, I'll just sort of scream out some of the numbers. You pick up $221 billion in expiring tax cuts, $95 billion pickup in the payroll tax holiday that expires, tax extenders, investment tax credits, whatever, to promote public-private partnerships or use of innovative technology for renewable energy. You pick up $65 billion. But then here's what else happens. You lose $55 billion per year in defense spending and $55 billion a year in non-defense discretionary spending. And the final number is $26 billion in lost unemployment benefits. They expire too. So not only does the deficit increase if the Bush tax cuts expire, the purchasing power of the federal government declines dramatically overnight because of sequestration, the deficit agreement that was reached last August. I'll get into detail on that in a little bit. But that is a profound difference and effect on how the core projects are going to be funded if we do nothing. And just sort of put out there why it is so unfair. Len talked about, I think it was 10% that doesn't come back because of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. This is a chart that shows discretionary domestic spending at the bottom. And what you see is it essentially stays flat under current Congressional Budget Office projections, using 2012 as a baseline. So there's no growth, nothing taken into account for inflation. Yet, domestic discretionary spending effectively takes the burden of trying to figure out right now how to deal with the deficit, whereas all the mandatory spending and then interest payments on the debt keeps growing. And that's why you have that earlier slide with the numbers increasing as percentage of GDP out to 2085. And this is why you have such a problem in Congress right now to figure out how to solve the problem, to keep the federal presence in core projects and other federal spending for infrastructure. So what are the options for resolution? There's a couple. And this goes to the lame duck session. First of all, they can do nothing, which Congress tends to be good at. So if they do nothing, we drive the car over the fiscal cliff. The good news is, according to this chart, that we basically have a lower deficit immediately because of the pickup of revenue because of the expiration of tax cuts. If we stall everything, which is known as kicking the can down the road, what happens is the economy picks up hugely short term. GDP grows, according to this chart, by about 1.7%, which shows you how the times have changed. That's considered a good thing and robust at this point in time. And the deficit probably stays at around 2.5%. So that's sort of what we're looking at under the current scenario with nothing happening. If in the long term, under the fiscal cliff, because the revenues are, the tax revenues will go up, because spending goes down, in the long term you have an improved economic situation. Theoretically, you can perhaps put more dollars into core programs and other domestic spending. But if you stall everything, it's sort of like a catastrophe of the sort of biblical proportions. And essentially, everything goes to pot, you know, wholesale cuts in program spending, no new starts, and perhaps the best way to say it is the burden of doing core-related activities increasingly falls to the locals and the regional partners as opposed to the federal government, because there just isn't going to be any money at the federal level other than sort of closing down shop and finishing ongoing projects. So with that sort of rosy, optimistic outlook, so November 6th is election day. In California, it doesn't matter because we already know how California is going to vote. But if the rest of the country follows California's lead and Obama is reelected, then on November 13th, you have a president who basically plays poker for a pastime. And when anybody plays poker, you know you've got a bunch of cards, you look at them, you do your calculation of what your opponent has, and you bluff your way through, or you basically increase the ante and play the game to its end and win, if you're lucky. That's what I think Obama's going to do with the fiscal cliff scenario. So he's got 6 weeks to work with a Republican Congress, because the Senate will not be in majority control effectively because of the filibuster, whoever has control. And so he's got 6 weeks to deal with the tax cuts, the payroll holiday, all the things that I mentioned, and avoid the across-the-board spending cuts for domestic programs of $55 billion, effective January 2nd, 2013. So that's sort of why the lame duck is so important. If Romney wins the White House, my guess is that they all agree to delay the impact of the January 2nd cuts by 6 months to coincide with the continuing resolution that is going to be passed later this week by the Senate and sent to the President, which continues funding through March 27th of next year. So what's the prospect of policymaking actually doing something productive? This is an example of how Washington can make something really complicated. It doesn't show well, probably in the back, but there's a bunch of little circles with issues in them. And these are the projections of, quote, people like myself that were polled by the National Journal about what your predictions are for the next Congress. On the left side, it talks about the impact on the policymaking process if they do anything. On the right, on the bottom axis, what isn't showing up is the probability of it happening. And what you see, anything from energy to water resources, EPA rules, tax issues, rolling back EPA regs like Section 404 revisions or Waters of the United States revision definition of that. What you see is that these sort of, quote, professionals that do what I do back in DC put a high probability to a medium probability that Congress is going to do something. Reason, as I said earlier, you got this pressure of the fiscal cliff. So that will have a direct impact on core issues, be they streamlining, funding of projects, or what have you. And then finally, before we get into some of the sort of numbers issues and what the process might look like in the future, here's what we got. I mentioned earmarks. Right now we don't have any. I think we're going to see them come back. So anybody who has a project, get ready to figure out how you can call it a regional approach to solving nationally significant issues in water infrastructure. The second thing is we will see a word of rewrite. Tomorrow, I believe, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee will have a hearing on the need for a word of rewrite. And in the House, they did yesterday, I believe, a hearing on how to revise Section 404 permit conditions to streamline them and get out of sort of this endless environmental impact statement cycle that people experience when they have a 404 permit pending with the Corps. I don't necessarily say that's a hit on the Corps, it's just that the system is so outdated that it needs revision. And so that's going on to set the stage, perhaps to do a word of rewrite during the lame duck, that 6-week period. And the reason I feel comfortable saying that might happen is the not so well kept secret in Washington is both the House and Senate authorizing committees with jurisdiction over WRDA already have a bill drafted. They already have a strategy on how to get it put through Congress, at least, because of the earmark ban. And what they probably would have in the House if they go forward is a technical corrections WRDA bill with no projects in it. Just sort of, if you've got a project that needs credit reimbursement and there's a problem, they'll do a fix there. Maybe there's some streamlining what has to be done, but nothing that carries with it a real budget cost. In the Senate, the House is hoping the Senate will put in a bunch of authorizations based on chief's reports to move projects along. They get into a conference, and towards the end of the Congress in December of this year, they all work late into the night and they all wink at each other, they trade, and you come out at the end of the day with hopefully a WRDA reauthorization bill with new project authorizations and other fixes. That's sort of the game that they're looking at. We'll see if it happens. And then finally, just to reinforce how screwed up the sequestration issue is, the end of the year, $55 billion cuts in programs to the Corps and others. You can't see it too well, but you see a big blue circle there? That's basically all the non-earmark spending that's gone on in the past. That little sliver of the red line that has created the mess that we're faced with on the policy level is all the earmarks that are in the federal budget. Now, you don't have to be an economist, you don't have to be a mathematician to realize that we're not solving the problems that are basically constraining the Corps of Engineers with an anti-earmark situation. We're actually exacerbating it because we can't get these, affectionately use the term yo-yos, to sit down in a room and negotiate because they have no reason to negotiate because there's nothing in it for these members. So that's why I think the earmarks are going to change. People be back. Okay, this is the very scary document. Can you push again? This is that was and is the report the president had to submit to Congress that says, here's how I'm going to cut under the sequestration fiscal cliff scenario programs on January 2nd. If you read it, it's a political document based in facts. The president's OMB went through all the programs that are exempt and identified the cuts. For the Corps of Engineers, it's a 10%, average of 10% cut on budget authority as well as budget outlays. That's important because what happens is it translates in, the Corps' got a, under the FY13 number, I believe it's about a $4 billion total budget. Elaine can correct me if I'm wrong about that. So you take off anywhere from $400 to $500 million or thereabouts from the Corps' budget, and it's program by program by program, and you're already looking at reductions in past years. The purchasing power drops dramatically for Corps projects. So what you're faced with is a situation where Congress has now been given a formal document that says, here's what we're going to cut. Now, I don't think sequestration is ever going to happen. I think what's going to happen is these guys in the executive branch and in the congressional or legislative branch are going to say, this is stupid. We're going to drive this budget and the country right over the cliff and into just a huge disaster. So what will probably occur is they will then go back, as the tradition is, and look at where all these cuts are going to happen and try and figure out how they can do the least bit of damage to programs for funding into the next budget cycle. And so for the Corps, no new starts most likely will stay in place. And most likely haircuts around some of the projects that can afford them, and perhaps efforts like increasing local share of project costs to find savings. I'm just speculating, but these are some of the sort of get-out-of-jail card that the White House and the Congress can default to. Okay. So, fiscal 2013 is a fact or fiction. I'll go quickly through House status, Senate status, and the administration position. Let me say, in the interest of time, the administration position, they're not really going to be a player until Congress comes up with a solution. This administration has shown a real tendency to stay away from the debate and let Congress deal with the problems, and then when it comes to them, they will then decide whether they like it or not. And I think we're going to see that. So that will be the compromise, is at some point the White House will come back in and say during the lame duck, well, here's what we want, Congress, notwithstanding what you've come up with. So here's where we get into the current situation and its impact upon the Corps of Engineers. The Senate Appropriations Bill. If Roger were here, as I said, he'd say, I have your back. First of all, it provides $4.7 billion overall for the Corps' projects. That's a decrease of $271 million, but when you look at how that decrease is allocated or distributed within the various programs, it's manageable from an overall perspective to do as least damage as possible. What's interesting is that in the bill, there is language that basically says the administration's priority and criteria to enhance ports and navigation's economic viability, vitality, just as cooked. They don't like it, and they want reports back to Congress on how these criteria are being used and can it be better improved. Investigations, $1.7 billion. Over the President's budget request, not FY12, but over the President's budget request, $300 million boost, which is, again, confirmation that Congress, at least, understands the Corps' priorities and role it plays in commerce, in economic stability and growth is vital. Operations and maintenance remains essentially static at 2.4. And on the HMTF, the trust fund that Len talked about, they provide a boost of about $90 million. That still leaves billions in the account, but a little inside baseball. Part of this is a function of the RAMP Act, where the appropriators tried to, or the authorizers tried to dictate that all the dollars that are in the fund at any given year need to be spent out in that year. And the appropriators don't like to be told how to spend their money by the authorizers. Is a little bit like going home to your wife and saying you want to buy a Tesla, and she says you're not doing that. So essentially, what's happened is that the appropriators boosted the funding above what the administration requested from the fund, but it's far below what's in the fund. The fund currently has about almost $7 billion sitting in it. And then there's language in the Senate bill that talks about the fact that if we don't fix our ports and harbors, and we don't fix our inland waterways, we have a real problem on international competitiveness because the boats are getting too big. The drafts are too deep. This is where the world is headed. We need to recognize that. So, next slide. So essentially, the spending bill continues to move forward and gets into levee protection, and they question the financing structure of the program that the Corps has right now. Not because the Corps is doing a bad job, but they're concerned that in the standards and reviews that are going on, the Corps is not being sensitive to the economic circumstances of communities, as well as the priority that overwhelming locals with safety concerns, that those safety concerns may far outweigh the benefits that would be delivered. And so the levee protection element of the Corps' work, the Congress, at least in the Senate, is saying, we want you to reconsider what guides your decision-making process in those areas. Again, this goes back to finding a new reality and finding new ways to do the old business. And finally, what I thought was interesting was this quote in the report that essentially says to the administration, not so much the Corps, because they recognize that the Corps' budget ultimately is approved and sanctioned by the Office of Management and Budget. They say basically you're being penny wise and pound foolish when it comes to how you're dealing with many of these programs that are under your authority. We want you to look at them and try and figure out a way to do it better, cheaper, and deliver results to the locals. Next. And I thought, to close on the Senate situation, this bottom line in the bill, the report, basically truncated, but it says that the committee believes it's important that Congress rethink, for the Congress to rethink the federal role in water transportation, because if we don't, we're not going to have the infrastructure in place to deal with the needs in the next 50 to 100 years of our infrastructure for water and transportation of goods and services. So that is in the bill. That is a direct statement that we want to redesign the policy and WRDA is the avenue to do it. And so complacency is not an option when we look at the future on how we're going to deal with core programs, they're saying. And I think that's a good thing, because when you have the appropriators saying to the authorizers, we're on the same page you're on, let's get something, let's update the programs, that's a good thing. And in the House, very quickly, similar number, $4.7 billion overall. Important thing to take away is when they sit down and negotiate a final budget number between November 13th and hopefully June or January 1st, if not sometime before March 27th when the CR expires. They're not going to be talking about overall funding level numbers, probably. They're going to be talking about individual programs because the overall numbers are so close. And again, the construction account, investigation accounts, O&M are basically all the same as the Senate. Again, there's frustration with the inconsistent use of criteria to identify priorities and comprehensive planning needs. And again, they provide $1 billion for the trust fund. Although they boost it by $152 million above the request. Remember, the Senate provided $90 million. So essentially, you have bills that are, for the Corps' purposes, you can sort of see where things are going to head. It's a lean budget, but if it comes out, it's a manageable budget if you're trying. When you look at other federal agencies and what they're under the knife to experience. Next. The House also wants more accountability on flood protection actions and policies, much like the Senate. It's interesting, they want a new approach to non-federal project sponsor credits. They've heard too much about challenges in getting credit for work that has been done prior to the Corps' ability, no fault of the Corps, but prior to the Corps' ability to get in and do their work. So what they're saying is if you've got a project that can be funded and you're ready to roll, go forward. Corps, there should be a way that you can give them credit when you come in. And that's, again, the new realities. Let's get the projects built. Let's not stand on technicalities. Ecosystem project metrics to establish priorities. This is the Aquatic Ecosystem Restoration Program that Corps has used in California to a great degree of success, whether it's abandoned mine cleanups, watershed, what have you. They're concerned in Congress that there's no real scientific basis or technical basis on how they decide which projects to fund. So they're saying, come up with some new metrics on priorities to be funded by the Aquatic Ecosystem Restoration Program. New starts. There are new starts in the Senate bill. There's about 3 or 4. Again, because the anti-earmark policy, they say to the Corps, go off and find some projects that are good to do. Here's the money. In the House, what they say is, we are just done with you guys in the Corps. Sorry, Len. We don't see a 5-year planning process. We've asked you for it in FY10, FY11, FY12, or into FY13. Therefore, we're not going to let you do any new starts until you get us that planning process. You can see what's going on. There's not enough money to do what people want to do, so the policymakers default to sort of beating up on the bureaucrats to get things done so they can at least point to priorities and figure out what's going on. There's a ton of money. You'd see new starts all over the place. And finally, just for those of you who are concerned about the Waters of the United States definition that the Supreme Court ruled many, many years ago, and Congress has been tied up in knots on this issue on how you define a water of the United States subject to a Section 404 permit. There's a policy rider in the House bill that precludes any use of funding in FY13 by EPA and the Corps to revamp the 404 permit process. So, options for the future. So I told John I wouldn't say too much on this, only because of the Corps is in a much better position. But let me suggest a couple of things. The key issue for the Corps and the stakeholders who work with the Corps is to remain relevant in a changing policy environment, because you are going to have everybody in the policy-making environment, whether it's an EPA, the Corps, the Bureau of Reclamation, whatever alphabet bureaucracy you want to point to, they're going to be trying to reinvent themselves and be relevant. And I like to use, as an example, Elon Musk and NASA, partly because he's just down the road, so to speak. But when NASA ran into trouble with the retirement of the shuttle, when NASA didn't realize they didn't have enough money to do what they wanted to do, what did they do? They put out a competitive solicitation to let the private side do some of the lifting of payloads to the space station. They figured out a way to remain relevant within the context of declining budgets. That's what has to happen in the Corps policy process. That's what's going to happen in WordUp, I believe. And it will require a new way of thinking creatively, as the cliche goes, outside the box. And so what are some of those things? First, there's a 3x3x3 process. For those of you that aren't aware of that, that's the Corps' effort to complete feasibility studies in 3 years at no more than $3 million in a 3-inch, 3-ring binder. Now, here's the challenge. Even with little small fonts, I can't wait to see Len jam all that paper into a 3-inch.
Tiny font. Exactly.
And so it's a little bit like going back to college and having a open book notes test, right? You've got everything sideways, upside down. But so this is an approach that has gained some traction in Congress, at least for smaller projects, and it's implicitly, if not somewhat explicitly, endorsed in the appropriation bills. The challenge is that the Congress does not inform the staff. The appropriations and authorizing committees have asked the question, how do you get these big projects into a 3-ring binder under 3 years and under $3 million? They're skeptical. So they need to be proven wrong, if you will. For smaller projects, it probably works, like the ecosystem restoration type activities where you can sort of put something together very quickly. That's one concept that is being looked at and has some traction in DC. Public-private partnerships. This is like the equivalent of Dustin Hoffman having the words plastic whispered into his ear in The Graduate. Everybody's into public-private partnerships now because it's a way to offload some of the costs on the private sector. Whether this works for core projects, I don't know. I don't know who's going to invest in a levee protection program or dredging of a harbor. But people are looking at that as an option. And then finally, innovative planning. If there's a way to do planning in some cost-effective manner, can streamline the permitting process, that will gain traction too, because I think there is a understanding that we have to figure out ways to reduce costs through that process also. And then finally, multiple benefits. To the extent that you can have a regional project, to the extent that you can demonstrate environmental, commerce, you name it, employment, jobs creation, technology advancement, the ability to show that those activities are occurring with your project, that should enhance the ability to get the project moving forward, more so than ever before, because it's a way, again, to sort of say the federal dollar that's being committed to the project is going to return a lot more back in national benefits. So I'm going to stop there in the interest of time, because I know we started late. And
Eric, thank you very much, and please stay up there. We have some questions, and if you have a question for Eric, please raise your hand and you'll get a blue card, receive a blue card, and we'll collect it back. We have a couple of questions, Eric. if the status quo remains, Congress is divided, the president's reelected. There's a comment 4 years ago by, I believe, Senate Leader Mitch McConnell that his job was to make sure that the president is not reelected, and therefore we've had a quagmire in Congress. If everything remains the same, is the Congress and the president going to work together rather than trying to work to defeat the president since he won't be up for reelection?
Yeah, I think in our line of work, we have to be optimistic, right? Whether you're a public official who's elected or a public official that implements the policies. My guess is that if Obama's were being reelected, that people are going to throw up their hands and say, we've got to at least get something done. We can't stay, because as the charts show, the inevitable outcome is a crash and burn scenario. So the first thing I think you'll see is the Senate will basically say, let's give the president his political appointments, the ones that we've been blocking. And let's at least give them the tools to have folks do their job. So I think that's the first thing. And then the second thing is they're going to have to come up with some solution to the spending.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Now I need to point out we have a staff member from Congressman Brian Hooker from Congressman Garamendi here. Congressman Garamendi has been one of our supporters on core-related issues and other related issues, and one of the ones who stood out in strong support of the RAMP Act. So we appreciate his support, Congressman Garamendi's support, and Brian's participation here today. The next question, if your growing deficits graphs are deficit graph are correct, what are the war costs and the war costs accounted for? How are they accounted for consistently going back in time as well as forward in terms of the deficit? You got the war cost and having to cut the money.
Well, I think the quick answer to that, if I understand it correctly, is they talk about the $1 trillion in savings because the war in Iraq is essentially over. Afghanistan is winding down, will be over. And as is true to form, both Congress and the White House have effectively spent that $1 trillion savings 3 times over or whatever. So I think if you're asking, does that help out in the deficit situation? Not really. It does add a little bit to the effort to save money, but those dollars have already been accounted for.
This is also economically, politically driven. From an economic viewpoint, do you think that both tax revenue, cutting expenses, is a parochial solution to solve the budget deficit, i.e. the Simpson-Bowl proposal that was put forward that Congress did not accept?
So, say economic view,
the tax revenue and cutting expenses is a
parochial solution. No, I mean, there's, what's the old line? There's 3 things. There's capital, labor, and materials. And you can only, in government, you've got capital and how you spend it. So what they have to do is they have to figure out a way to cut spending. They have to figure out how to raise revenue if they're going to ever get close to some kind of reversal in the deficit out-year growth.
Great. Can you please clarify the policy rider provision on the waters of the U.S.?
So waters of the United States, years ago there were two separate court decisions in separate years where the Supreme Court basically said that essentially EPA and the Corps, you sort of overstepped your boundaries on what constituted a water, for purposes of the Clean Water Act definition, for regulation as, quote, a water of the United States or a navigable waterway. And what they said was, because they couldn't come up, the court could not come up with a unified majority opinion, it was a plurality opinion, without getting too steeped into the workings of the process and the decision. Essentially they said to EPA, you can't do it that way. Do it on a case-by-case basis to determine whether there's a true nexus between a receiving water and, say, an isolated water like a wetland or a vernal pool, for example. So that sort of morphed into, we have to revamp the way we do Section 404 permitting in general. It's a case-by-case basis. So what's happening now is and this has basically been driven by the agricultural interest, but it has impacts, obviously, on dredging activities for ports and harbors and what have you. But what's happening is that the Congress, in the form of, let's say, a little more to the right of center and center members, are suggesting that if you try to impose EPA your new standards on what defines a water United States, you're going to shut down all sorts of commerce, development, and what have you. So you are going to be precluded from changing the rules of the road that are in place right now that govern an entity securing a 404 permit. You know, the outrageous example that I believe, at least is outrageous, is a concern that, for example, a water supply conveyance system could be defined as a water of the United States simply because it's an open canal. I don't think that would happen, but that is sort of when you're looking for ghosts or skeletons, that's what's being stated as a concern.
Great, thank you. In terms of the projected budget deficits over the next 20 years, can you comment on the possibility of the impact of raising interest rates and printing more money? You want me to read it again?
I don't know. I found out I could get a car loan for 1.9% at my credit union the other day. So I think, you know, look, whether we have more money printed or interest rates go up or whatever, that is such a macro level. I don't mean to dispense with it rudely, but you know, the problem is, even if you have increasing interest rates or you print more money, it doesn't do away or mitigate against dealing with the deficit. We are on a track for exponential growth because of entitlements. So they've got to find another way to deal with the underlying problem. I think, I'll just say, what did Ben Bernanke say? We'll deal with inflation when we have to. You know, we'll pull back and raise rates. Until then, we've got to figure out a way to create jobs. And this gets back to the Corps' projects. One way they can create jobs, right, is dredging, maintenance, new starts. So that works in our favor.
Thank you. And so if President Romney wins, he gets rid of Ben Bernanke. Are you interested in the job?
I think you have problems now.
From the election impact side, can new priorities be addressed and funded under the rules of the 2013 continuing resolution?
No. Simple answer, no. The continuing resolution is simply that. FY12 spending levels, which by the way go up just marginally, but nobody really suffers a cut under the continuing resolution due to these sort of vagaries of setting budgets at the federal level and the agreements that were made last year as part of the Deficit Reduction Act, or Budget Deficit Control Act, excuse me. So essentially, under FY12, the numbers are basically stable, slight increase in overall spending, but no policy changes.
Okay, are there any other blue cards that people have questions for to be passed up forward? Then we have one, actually, I have a question closing, put you on the spot here, but this is not the question. This is from the audience. Why does it appear that California's 2 senators in the San Francisco Bay Area Congressional delegation are disengaged from funding core local water transportation projects compared to their peers on the Gulf Coast and Midwest?
Where's Brian Hooker?
He's right there.
Okay, close your ears.
Yeah.
I don't think they're disengaged. In fact, this is putting me on the spot. Okay, so here's the escapist answer. So in the last word of rewrite, Senator Boxer put a $40 million authorization for California projects. That was just a sort of open-ended buffet, if you will, that if you had a project and you didn't have an authorization, you could go forward and seek money under that authorization. I think it was section 1635 of the last word. Sounds good, right?
Sounds like an earmark.
Well, it was programmatic because it's California. So you go petition the executive branch, say, hey, go to Len. Tell them, hey, I need some money, you got this authorization. I think the answer, though, is that the appropriators and other members of Congress said, you know, if that's what you want, fine. We'll not fund another specific line item project for California because you got your own authorization. So they sort of throw up this block. The other thing is, short of the Delta collapsing, Louisiana, Mississippi, two things are going on. First of all, you had Katrina. The second thing is, particularly in the Senate, and this is not to suggest that Senator Feinstein is not able to do something, because she's been very productive in delivering money for the Delta and for other projects across the board. The challenge you have is California has so many needs. And as I like to say, particularly since Senator Feinstein is the appropriator for the state, she's got 35 to 40 million requests coming into her office for help. This was before the earmark bans. Now, in Mississippi or Louisiana, you might have 500. It's a lot easier to make decisions and make everybody happy when you've got 500 folks. Plus, you got Katrina or Isaac or whoever that has just said, we have an emergency disaster. A lot of the money actually that went to Mississippi or Louisiana is, quote, in the emergency account. So I say this with some trepidation, but if you want more money in California, let the Delta collapse. You'll get tons of money. But sort of all seriousness, they do a good job. And keep in mind, Senator Boxer was able to get WRDA through after what? 10 years of trying by other members of Congress last time around. So that's my, shall we say, political response. The other response is Mississippi and Louisiana ain't going to be as happy after the fiscal cliff kicks in. So I think that's the quick answer.
Okay. Eric, thank you. Before you leave, though, all this Eric's slides and all the slides you'll see later will be up on our website by Monday in the event you're in the back and you couldn't see them or you want to be able to get them and download them. So they'll be up on Monday. And Eric, I have one question for you before you leave. Again, I need to comment, he has been phenomenal helping Bay Planning and many of our members in our efforts in DC. So he came out from Washington, DC for this. And if you have questions or need assistance, please talk to Eric at the break. I'm going to ask Eric one more question. Then we're going to have a 15-minute break, reconvene, and so on. So the House stays the same, the Senate stays the same. How much is the president going to win, and is he going to? How much is he going to win by? Is it going to be 7%, 2%? Is there going to be a Florida out there with the court making a decision?
I can only respond by saying there's at least 47%
that are not voting for.
No, that are voting.
Oh, okay. Eric, thank you very much.